Great, welcome everyone. I will take care of some quick housekeeping as we get more people added to our Zoom link here. Welcome to another echo session for the MHIDD project. This is part of our fall 2024 series, which has been designed specifically with support coordinators and case and care managers in mind. Our topics were chosen by a group of support coordinators along with a self-advocate. That being said, if you are not a support coordinator or care or case manager, you are welcome to attend. We aren't excluding anyone from this series. And at times our schedule may change according to presenter availability. If there are any changes to our last session, which is currently scheduled for January as a bonus session, we will make sure to let you know via email. All of our echo sessions are recorded, so this echo session is also being recorded for educational and quality purposes. By participating in this session, you are consenting to be recorded, but you are welcome to leave at any time. If you have any questions about Zoom functionality, such as raising your hand or renaming your profile, feel free to message me and I can help you work through those things. Where this is an echo session, we will have a case scenario discussion. We will also likely be sharing experiences from our personal work and life experience. When you're sharing information about another person, just be sure to not share any identifying information. So don't share anything such as their real name, any contact information. If you have a question about something you'd like to share and you're not sure whether or not you should share it, again, you can message me in chat here and I'll help you through that. This is an echo session, which is a little bit different from your traditional webinar. We'll start out with a didactic presentation from Dr. Llyod. You're welcome to keep your camera off during that portion of the session. We do ask that afterwards, when we start our case scenario discussion, you do turn on your camera if you're able to and unmute, because we are a lot more successful when we have participation from everybody. As I mentioned, this is different from a traditional webinar. It's more of a community of practice. We aim to share knowledge as a group. We will start out with our didactic presentation and then follow that up with a case scenario discussion and feedback. We will have one more session in this series that's planned for January after the holidays are wrapped up. If you have a case scenario related to mental health and intellectual and developmental disabilities for someone you support, we would love to bring that to the group for discussion at our next session. If you do, you can send me an email at rachel.byers@usu.edu. I will also drop my email in the chat a few times today. We'd love to have a case scenario from one of your practice situations. We offer free CEUs through the Utah Social Work Association for anyone who attends today and needs them. To receive those, you will need to fill out a survey for today's session. There's a link in the chat and we will drop that again later to make sure everybody has that. If you don't need a CEU, but you would like a certificate of attendance, we can provide that as well. Same thing, you'll just need to fill out that survey. If you'd like to access materials from previous ECHO sessions, or if you'd like to be able to see what's coming up in January, you are welcome to join the iEcho platform. If you're here today, you're probably already on the iEcho platform, but if you'd like to join or if you have questions about the iEcho platform or our ECHO series, again, you can send me an email. We do have some social media pages where we keep information about our ECHO series. We have multiple that are going on here at the Institute for Disability Research and Policy and Practice. So I'd encourage you to check that out and see if there are any other series that would interest you. Our final session as a bonus session for this fall 2024 series will be on January 27th, and that will be all about the home program at the University of Utah. If you are curious about learning more about that, we'll send a flyer out right after Christmas so we can get everybody registered. Last but not least, we are super lucky to have Dr. Thad Llyod here from the Utah State Hospital. He received his PhD from Brigham Young University with an emphasis in neuropsychology, and he's a licensed psychologist in the state of Utah. He completed both his internship and neuropsychological postdoctoral fellowship at the Utah State Hospital, where he is now employed as the Director of Psychology. Clinical interests and expertise include pediatric and general neuropsychology, neurocognitive remediation, behavior management, cognitive behavioral therapy, and working with individuals with borderline personality disorder. He has been formally trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, is a licensed facilitator of Circle of Security parenting, and has been intensively trained in dialectical behavioral therapy through Behavioral Tech. Although not a native of Utah, Dr. Llyod has called Utah home for the past 35 years. Prior to studying psychology, he was a music performance major in cello. While cello is his first love, he also enjoys playing piano and the organ, although not necessarily well. Most of his free time now, however, is spent interacting with his family. Together, they enjoy watching movies, exploring the great outdoors of Utah, and playing board games. I will turn the time over to you, Dr. Llyod. Feel free to share your slides and get started, and add anything to your introduction that you might want to.
Well, thank you very much. Let me see if I can figure this out. All right, can we see that there?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, 2020 kind of changed the way we all interact, and it seems now we are more prone to these less intimate video connections, which makes performing or presenting difficult, because I always feel like I just hear my office talking to myself. But I will do my best. I appreciate the opportunity to share some ideas that hopefully will be helpful. I don't know how helpful they'll be. I don't know how new these ideas or thoughts will be to you, but if any of you are able to glean a little bit of information and improve the care, coordination of care that you have with your clients and customers, well, then I thought this will be a success. You read through my bio, so you already kind of know these facts about me. The only thing I really like to add to that is in the 15 years I've been employed here at Utah State Hospital, my expertise has been sharpened in working with individuals of varying levels of cognitive abilities, as well as varying levels of mental health, and how those two kind of intersect and influence the individual's presentation and their ability to learn. So while I claimed in no way to be an expert in this area, I do feel like I have a fairly good working knowledge and a fairly good experiential foundation to approach the topic today. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, I've kind of organized this systematically, where we'll start talking about just basic background of cognitive domains and functionings, including the working memory model. As we talk through this, I hope that you will understand how important and understand a basic understanding of the working memory model, how that impacts learn and gain new skills. Talk about problems clients face. Look at this through errorful learning. Talk about the cognitive load theory. Then we'll end with just a conversation about how we can implement strategies to improve the care and opportunities to teach those who may have difficulty gaining information at the same level as their peers. So without further ado, here's kind of a diagram that a colleague and I created as we have done these presentations over the years to kind of capture what cognition, how it's organized, how it's structured, how our minds utilize it. When we think of cognitive capacity, this is really the skills that allow us to think, to learn, to solve problems, to adapt to new situations. There's been a lot of discussion around the concept of intelligence and what that looks like, what's it consist of, some arguing for like a general level of intelligence, other arguing for multiple levels of intelligence. But in general, when we talk about cognition, it's our ability to utilize the skills that you see displayed there in a meaningful and productive way. And the way we've organized this is kind of showing that there's a lot of overlap and a lot of integration between these skills. If you look at the bottom of the pyramid, I have processing speed. Processing speed is probably the most basic and fundamental cognitive ability we have. It's also notably one of the most difficult to remediate. So if a person has a processing speed deficit, that is often an impairment or an area of weakness that we're just going to have to learn to work around or work through. We put it as the foundation or the base in our pyramid because processing speed really influences everything else. It influences our ability to attend. It influences the effectiveness and the efficiency of our working memory. And as you can see, working memory at the top of the pyramid then integrates with all these other cognitive systems, everything from our ability to learn in school, our understanding and use, mastery of language, our ability to visually interact with our environment, to perceive, to mentally visualize, to manipulate images in our mind, all part of that visual spatial domain. Memory is really quintessential to who we are. We have aspects of our self, aspects of our ability to interact with the world that are based upon our past. So our ability to recall and to remember things is vital important to that, as well as just vital important to just being able to adapt and function in society. We can't recall or remember certain things. We're in a load of hurt. Information processing is really how our mind organizes the information that we have. So these are things you've heard like schemas or concepts, conceptual networks, association networks. It's just how information is kind of organized and stored in the brain. And then over there on the far side, we have higher order executive functions. These can be things like planning, inhibition, our ability to multitask or do multiple tasks at the same time, flexible thinking. These are all part of those higher order functions. So we have this immense cognitive framework, but at the core of this is working memory, attention, and process speed. And we're going to focus more on that working memory components. That's really kind of the interface where all of this comes together. And I should have said, if there's any questions or concerns, go ahead and interrupt me or raise the hand. If Rachel, if I missed something, if you just interrupt me so I can make sure we address any questions that we have along the way. So with working memory, this looks a little complex, and it is. And I want to kind of go through this to kind of help you guys understand this. And if you already understand this, I'm sorry if I'm going to draw this out. But our current working memory model theory breaks working memory down into four main components. I like to describe these as kind of like whiteboards in the brain. Whiteboards are places where we can write information, we can hold that information to utilize. And so on one side of the brain, we have a phonological loop. This whiteboard is particularly geared towards language-based information. When we hear information coming in through our ears, or even if we read information, if it's language-based, like we're reading words, that information is going to be stored briefly in that phonological loop. It has a visual spatial component or analog, if you will, on the other side there, the visual spatial sketch pad. This is the whiteboard where we have information that's visually brought into our minds. So if you're seeing images, pictures, when you glance down at the map and you're trying to figure your way through to an address, part of what you're utilizing is that visual spatial sketch pad. So you have these two separate whiteboards that hold language-based information or visual-based information. And then we have our episodic buffer. The role of the episodic buffer is to kind of begin to integrate that information. So it facilitates communication and integration of information from our phonological loop and our visual spatial sketch pad. And this is where we put this information come together, but not just the information from those two places. Now we begin to pull in information from our long-term memory. And we start tying that information to things that we know about ourselves, about the past, about other things around us. So the episodic buffer is really kind of that active part of working memory thinking, where we have to integrate all this information, both the current, the immediate information with our past information. And the role of the central executive then offers kind of the control. It helps to attend or guide our attention. It helps to select the information that we're pulling in from our past to utilize or to integrate into that episodic buffer with information in our episodic buffer. Well, that's a lot of words I've just thrown out here. So let me give a couple of examples. So one example I often give is like when you go out to eat and you are presented with a bill and you're trying to calculate the tip that you want to leave. What sort of things are going to be factors into how much of a tip you leave? Well, one of those things is just going to be the amount of the bill. So you're going to look down at that and see the total on that. And that's going to go into that visual spatial sketch pad. And then also we'll need to figure out what is a reasonable percentage. And so we might take into consideration the quality of the service that we had, right? So we might pull in past memories of, okay, when we ate at this restaurant before, or compared to other servers I've had, our server was particularly attentive. They were particularly inattentive, or problematic, right? They spilt their soda all over us, or whatever the case may be. We start integrating some of that information. Maybe you find your server to be a little bit attractive. Maybe that increases how much you want to add to your tip. All these different factors may come into play. Maybe you're comparing where you're eating. Are you eating at, say, like a Denny's versus some really formal, fancy sit down? You might calculate your tip differently based upon all this information. And the final thing you're going to need is just the calculation, the percentage. So let's say you conclude you wanted to leave a tip for 20%. You need to be able to calculate that 20% tip in your mind. That's all part of that working memory. It's integrating all that past information, all the current information, incorporating emotional experience, everything going on in the here and now into that manipulation of that information that you need for that output of what the amount of tip that you want to leave. Let me give you another example to kind of demonstrate how our working memory can be problematic. For literally years, my wife and I talked about this episode of this TV show that we found particularly funny. And in the scene, this family is kind of your, I guess, quintessential American white trash fan. It's a terrible thing to say, but there's kind of a blue collar family that we resonate well with, and they're out bowling with their family. And next to them, in the lane next to them, is this family. You know the type. Maybe you are that type, right? The ones with the bumper sticker of the star kids, and they're just having a great time. And a little competition begins to form between the two families. And my wife and I, we'd share this story all the time. Our favorite scene, our favorite memory of the story is when the one family turns to the other family like, and says, "Congratulations on winning the competition nobody is having." Right? That was like the highlight of this scene for us. And we would tell everybody this. Well, we decided to show our kids this scene. So we looked it up on YouTube. We pull up this scene, and we watched the episode. And guess what? It does not say that phrase at all in this movie. And we looked at each other like, how on earth do we remember this so differently, right? Both of us have strong memories of that line, "Congratulations on winning the competition that no one's having," as being a part of the show, but it in reality is not even a part of the show. It was never said. And it made me think, like, with our working memory, whenever we pull information in, whenever we're telling a story, we're modifying that information. And this is where you can get into some problems, right? As over time, we can then begin to shape that information based upon not only our current situation, but the emotional and the other factors going on in our life in that situation. So that information can get drastically shifted and changed and stored back in the brain inappropriately. So how does this apply to what we want to know now? Well, working memory is the workhorse for therapeutic interaction. When we're trying to help teach our clients skills, we're trying to help them make changes in their lives, it is utilizing working memory. That is the therapeutic tool that we are utilizing. So what problems do we run into when working memory is not functioning at the level or the way that we need it to? And that's kind of where we're going to shift our conversation. Getting a little, there we go. We're going to shift our conversation. The cognitive load of therapy. Think about therapy now. That's a question for you. When you think of your typical therapeutic interaction, and we think of non-adaptive traditional therapy, it's like your typical therapy you might see, you go see your therapist. What are the cognitive demands of that session? think through this for a second. I won't, if you want to reply, you can reply, but it's a question I want you to be thinking, like, what are the typical cognitive demands in any given session you're having or interaction with a client? Well, one of those things is going to be attention, right? We have to be able to attend to the content of the session. Our client has to be able to stay with us and avoid being distracted by internal and external distractions, right? Internal distractions could be intrusive thoughts, or you're thinking about what they're going to have for dinner, or whatever the case may be. External distractors can be everything from environmental sounds, people walking through the office or out in the hallway, even just like visual things you may have in your office. If you look around my office, it's the image doesn't look too bad in the picture, but if I were to show you my whole office and my desk, you would see how cluttered my office really is, right? I work with little kids, so I have lots of toys and little gadgets everywhere for the kids to play with. But all these can be distractors. So the individual has to be able to attend to what we're saying, avoid all these distractions, and focus on the gist of what we're saying. Right? Part of that is also evaluating, ignoring irrelevant information. Language, both expressive and receptive functions. Are they able to understand what we are saying? Are they able to adequately express what it is they're thinking or what's on their mind? Both can be impaired. One person can have deficits both in understanding and expressing, or just deficits in one area or the other. But language is a major part of what we do. We're talking. We are a talkative profession. So we're in the profession for, right? The change of talk. Our mental speed, we talked about that being at base of that pyramid. It influences how quickly and how efficiently we can do all these other skills that we're talking about. The complexity of information processing. Think about a typical therapy session. What is involved in that? What are some of the complex information networks that we're trying to tap into, right? Things like associations, using analogies, right? How many of you in your work with clients have used analogies? Because we think analogies are great, right? They're a great way of communicating meaning through symbolism. Yet the understanding of symbolism is a fairly complex cognitive task. We involve decision making in our therapeutic processes. We are often asking clients questions and asking them to make decisions. So it's a high demand. What about mental flexibility? Did any of you think of that? What type of mental flexibility is involved in the work that we do with clients? Again, essentially, we're trying to ask people to start thinking outside the box, to look at things from different perspectives, right? Social skills training, right? How do we take perspective of others? All this involves mental flexibility and our ability to shift from one topic to the next, or from one idea to the next, not get stuck or rooted into one particular response. I mentioned this a little bit above, but abstraction, again, we are involved with making and understanding these associations, understanding of metaphors and analogies. Self-awareness, again, one of the main roles of therapy is to help increase people's self-awareness. But what does that imply? When you think of that working memory model, self-awareness is not only the ability to sit in the here and now, but then again to tie that back to all of our past experience, all the things that's happened in the past, bring it to the forefront, and be able to integrate that in a way that gives us insight or meaning to who we are. Are we a caring, compassionate person? How does that fit with our past experience, right? We tend to be impulsive. Again, how does this all tie into who we are? And then finally, emotional upheaval. For all these cognitive factors I described, one that I didn't really go into detail is the impact that emotion can have. And we know that when individuals become emotionally dysregulated, anxiety, depression, frustration, or anger, all these can hijack a person's ability to use those mental skills effectively. It can be an overriding, if you will. So when you think about especially in the work that I do, working with clients who are suicidal, who have difficult challenges they face, trauma, experience of those things. Those emotional responses, those emotional factors can really jump in and hijack the session of the situation, can make their ability to uh, engage their cognitive abilities much more difficult or much more impaired. Research has shown that individuals with depression and anxiety score less or lower on tests of cognition, like IQ tests, IQ measures. So those internal emotional states can be very, very impactful. So these are all things that are going on simultaneously in any interaction, especially a therapeutic interaction. So I return to this question. I want to ask this, think about this for a second. A typical therapy session might start off with a question similar to this. Have you been feeling better since last time we met? Okay. So think about that for just a second. What is needed to answer this question? Let me give you just a minute to think about that. I don't know if anyone's brave enough to unmic and answer that question, but I would entertain that. What are some of the things that are required for us to answer this question from a cognitive standpoint?
First thing I think of is recall.
And what do you mean by that, Rachel?
Being able to remember what happened since you last met with them as the person attending the appointment. So abstraction, I think, is part of that.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Recall, one, in abstraction, like just the passage of time, right? What does that mean? The last time we met, when did we last meet? Was it a week ago? Was it yesterday? That ability to understand that reference point to each other, the recall or the memory of how was I feeling last time, right? Um, any other thoughts? What about the ability to compare and contrast, right? We're looking at, okay, how was I feeling then? And remembering and recalling what that was versus how that compared to now. Is it improved? Is it the same? Is it gotten worse? Right? Even more fundamentally, our ability to label and understand feelings. How many times do we have clients that struggle with being able just to do that? That may confuse anger with fear, right? Or disgust and fear. These different emotions that they may not be able to completely label. And there's also some inductive reasoning, like what is the therapist really asking? Right? Therapist wants to know generally, kind of like, are things improving for you? How's treatment coming? How's life, right? As opposed to just this more basic, rigid interpretation of the answer. So this idea of therapy is very cognitively demanding on individuals, particularly individuals who have of normal to above average intellectual abilities. When you consider individuals who are cognitively compromised for a variety of reasons, the engagement in therapy can be a much more difficult task. And so we need to be mindful of that. All right, we're going to have some fun to demonstrate things. You can do this on your own. There are two tasks here, and you may have seen this before. If so, great. But with the dots, over here we have an array of 9 dots. Your challenge is to connect all the dots using 4 straight lines, but never lifting your pencil off the page. So how would you do that to make 4 straight lines and be able to touch or bisect all of those dots? Okay. And then the other challenge is be looking at these supplies given you. You have some thumbtacks, you have a candle, string, and you have some matches. Your task is to attach that candle or to conceptualize how would you attach that candle to a wall and then light it so it was able to be lit safely. I'm going to give you maybe 2-3 minutes to figure this through, and then we'll come through and we'll answer this. Always awkward in a meeting to have no talking. So we'll move on here. But so with the dots, anyone willing to talk about how they solved this problem? Did anyone come up with a solution?
I know I've done this before, but it's been long enough that I can't remember. So I'm hoping somebody else has figured it out.
And just as importantly,
second
maybe
you on that one.
What's that, Melissa?
I said, Rachel, I'm gonna second you on that one because I haven't done this since like I think my second year of college.
Well, let me ask you a question, Melissa, since you were brave enough to speak up. I'm assuming you were attempting to figure it out in your mind, maybe even drew on your finger on the board or a piece of paper. How are you approaching this problem?
I keep thinking in the corners is where I would probably start the line, but I always end up like getting more than I want it to.
So I'm imagining you start in the corner and then you're drawing a line down and doing this and you're doing different configurations, always coming back to the same problem. Like you miss a dot here or there.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, here's the answer, right? Maybe I can. There we go.
Yep.
We'll come back and talk about this. I want to switch over to the candle now. Did anybody figure out how to attach the candle to a wall using just those items there, then light successfully?
My first thought was to use the matchbox itself, take the matches out of the box and then pin the box to the wall, and then you just set the candle in the box and light it.
And is that Eric who was just speaking?
Yeah.
And Eric, you actually have solved the problem correctly, right? So the purpose of this slide is twofold. One is to introduce this idea of functional fixedness. This is a concept. Our clients, well, anybody can get into this rut of thinking, right? When we look at the solution with the matches and the candle, often we are bound by the way we conceptualize things. Like a matchbox in this situation is nothing more than a container to hold the matches. We forget that it's also one of the resources that we have to utilize. And so it's easy for people to skip over or to skip considering using the matchbox as a shelf because, we get stuck in that thinking that, okay, the matchbox book is only to hold the matches. But similarly, with the dots, we may have done the same thing. I didn't give you some information. I didn't tell you there was no bounds with the lines, right? But in our mind, we naturally felt like we had to keep the lines within the parameters of the dots. And obviously the solution requires us to go over the edges or beyond the parameters of the dots. But the other thing I was hoping to demonstrate with these two examples is that most of us probably, in looking at these, went through a series of trial and error learning. And this is going to take us into our next part of our conversation, that most of the learning that we do is error-full learning, or another way of putting this, it's trial and error learning. This isn't particularly efficient, but it is relatively simple and effective, and most of us can utilize that. When we think about this, what are our cognitive functions that are needed for successful error-full learning? Well, one, we have to be able to employ inductive or deductive reasoning. So going back to our previous examples, we start creating hypotheses, looking at the information we have and seeing how it may associate or tie together to bring us to some larger or narrower conclusions. We have to be able to engage in prediction or anticipatory judgment. Again, planning, being able to see things 2 or 3 steps ahead, and then maybe playing that out in our mind or physically producing the results and seeing how our predictions came out. We have to employ that working memory again. There's that darn working memory. And working memory is vitally important because what we have to do is be able to hold in the information of things that we tried. So Melissa, you talked about you started in the corner. Well, let's say you started in the corner and you went to the right and then down and then up at an angle and then down. Next time you might be like, well, I'm gonna start in this corner, but this time I'm gonna go down because when I went across, it didn't work, right? We have to remember the previous things that we tried, the previous things that were unsuccessful for us, so we can adjust, we can adapt and try something new. Long-term memory. I didn't ask you this, Eric, but have you seen that before, perchance, that candle?
I haven't, but what you mentioned hit home a little bit because the first thing I thought of was the string. My mind went to the string first to wrap it around the candle and then maybe pin the string on each side of the candle. And then the safety issue hit me. And I was like, okay, I got to look at other, I'm going to start something on fire where I can't separate it from the wall a little bit.
Yeah, open flame that close to the wall.
Yeah,
not a good idea.
Then I kind of expanded my thinking a little bit, and then I was like, "Oh, you've got some other things there that I, like you said, I didn't think of at first."
Great, and it's a great example for like your long-term memory, your working memory tapped into your experience of things of safety. Hopefully, not prior experiences with fire, but maybe right where you've learned like, okay, an open flame next to a wall or next to a potentially flammable surface could be dangerous, and so I need to look at this differently, right? So again, after that long-term memory kicks in, and this concept of flexibility, this functional fix, just requires you to be able to think flexibly or look at things from a different perspective. Now, unfortunately, what research has shown is individuals who are cognitively compromised. These are individuals who have lower IQ, as well as individuals who've had traumatic brain injuries or deficits in their attention as a result of an acquired brain injury. They're more likely to make two types of errors. One, when they're looking at solutions, predicting or making a judgment call, they're more likely to think of the wrong answer than the correct answer. I don't know why that is. It just happens to be. Maybe there's something about intuition that gets disrupted. We didn't talk about intuition, but that could certainly be a part of those higher order functions. Intuition is kind of this sense of knowing. Maybe it's part of their intuition's off, and so they make just poor choices. They're more likely to think of the wrong answer first. And then what unfortunately also happens is those wrong answers then get reinforced. And so the next time they're faced with a similar situation or a similar problem, they're more likely to, again, give the wrong answer. Let me give you an example. You notice on the screen I have this snapshot. This is from a game called, what's this game called? My daughter plays this game.
Is that Hogwarts?
Yes, the Harry Potter Hogwarts mystery, right? It's one of these kind of first player type games where you go through and you solve puzzles and do different things. And my daughter, who I love and adore, who also has severe ADHD, she was talking to me about this. So one of the things, they have these interactions with their friends, I guess, and they're asked questions, and there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer. And she was talking about this and every time you interact with a friend, I guess it's the same set of questions. So you just you learn over time the right response. But she was talking about every time she would see this question, she would recognize she had like this what she called an intuition, or she felt like the right answer was this one answer, and she would select it only to find out it was wrong. And she remember, I selected this last time. Like, why can't I remember this is the wrong answer? Every time I face this question, I always think this is the right answer, even though after I select it and I see it's wrong, I remember that it was wrong last time. Does that make sense? Well, this kind of illustrates this example, like, ADHD being a disorder of executive functioning in the working memory system, she's more likely to be primed. So she's been primed to give that wrong response. She doesn't remember it was wrong in the moment. She just remembers, I've seen this response before, and this is the response I've given in the past. And so she assumes it must be the correct response. And then inadvertently, it's the wrong response. And that just gets reinforced over and over and over again until she had to learn and employ a different strategy to disrupt that response system. So I thought that was she was telling me about that, like, oh, this is a great example of errorful learning, how I'm going to use this when I do presentations and talk about this. I'll give you one more example. I was working with a client who had suffered a massive TBI. This is back when I was in grad school. So this is about, good grief, 20 years ago. I was working in the clinic over at BYU. He was a young man in his 20s. He'd suffered a massive head injury in an automobile accident. He was unrestrained and not wearing a seatbelt, nearly lost his life. As a result of his traumatic brain injury, just very cognitively impaired. But one of the things he struggled the most was his interpersonal relationships. He was just wildly inappropriate in his interpersonal relationships, had a hard time inhibiting himself. And so we would work in session and we'd talk and we'd go and I just would basically lecture him, right? And teach him all the things he needed to be doing, how to be a better, use interpersonal skills better. And then without fail, we spend an hour talking about these things, and then we'd walk out. And as we'd walk out, he'd go up. We had a reception desk, and there was this cute receptionist who worked there, and he'd go up there and be like, "Have you been running around?" Or somebody just said something like, "Are you tired because you've been running around my head all day long?" Right? Just get some really corny, bad, uncomfortable pickup line, and I'd watch the receptionist kind of like squirm in her chair, and she'd be kind of like, not knowing how to respond, right? And I'd just like face palm over there, like, dude, Tim, we just got, and his name wasn't Tim, that's a pseudonym. Like, Tim, we just got done talking about that. Like, why can you not remember from 30 seconds ago walking out the door? Well, because this is part of the impairment, right? Like his inability to recall and retain that information. He's primed because he's given these bad pickup lines. He's been reinforced for that for whatever reason, and we weren't addressing the right thing. So kind of setting the frame for part of the problem, some of the problems our clients will see. So cognitive load theory basically states that if we can decrease the cognitive demands required of the individual as part of the learning process, they're going to be able to maximize or learn better through that. So we need to simplify what it is they're being called upon, their cognitive system is being called upon to do. And if we can do that, if we limit those demands on working memory, we utilize their strengths, the things that they do well, this will improve their capacity to learn and develop new skills, learn and develop new ways of responding to their environment. So one of the first things we want to do when working with clients who are cognitively limited is we need to get a good cognitive profile of what their skill set is. So when possible, either request, or if they've already had one done, access, if you can, neuropsychological evaluation. I say neuropsychological evaluation because those tend to be more in depth. The typical psychological evaluation usually covers like IQ, maybe some memory, maybe some academic scores, but neuropsych's usually going to give you more in-depth information on all those different domains that we kind of had outlined above. Their language processing, both expressive, receptive, their memory capacity, both for like decoding it, storing it, and recalling it, their higher executive functions. All these domains are going to be touched upon in that evaluation. You get a profile of things that they're strong with, things that maybe average on, and things that they really struggle, maybe are impaired on. We want to know critically where their working memory capacity is. There's a saying in working memory, an average individual can hold 7 plus or minus 2 items in their memory. That means like if I read you a list of words, you would be able to recall 7 plus or minus 2 of those words upon hearing that list of words. Those who are cognitively impaired, that's probably more like 3 plus or minus 2. So you look at that, that's a vast difference in what they're capable of holding in that working memory. So again, in comparison, if you read them a word list, they might recall 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 of those words, whereas the average individual is probably recall 7, 8, or 9 of those words. We need to know kind of where their threshold is. We also need to know what their language functioning is. The average adult has a vocabulary in the tens to hundreds of thousands. An IQ of 75, 60, which is equivalent to maybe say like a child in its capacity, has an IQ probably somewhere around 10 to 15,000 words. So if you're coming in at 200,000 words in your vocabulary and they're operating with like 10,000 words, you can see there's going to be a big disconnect. So we need to know where their language functioning is, so we can simplify and use words that are going to be within their scope of understanding. And then we're going to shift now and talk about errorless learning strategies. This is where a lot of research, both in the rehabilitation literature as well as the academic literature, has shown to be very effective in helping to teach new skills, teach new things, principles to kids who struggle or those who are cognitively challenged. So The concept of errorless learning is that we are adjusting our teaching style in such a way that we're reducing in the overall cognitive demand, and we're trying to remove limits of learning that occur through trial by error. Primary goal there is to ensure that when the individual responds, either they're answering a question or they're making a response in association to something, a demand in the environment, that their response that they give is going to be the correct response. Why might that be important? Again, thinking back to that working memory model, right? They're more likely to give the wrong answer the first time, and those wrong answers are more likely to be reinforced. And so we want to set up a situation where the response they're going to give is likely going to be the correct response. And then through that process, that becomes now the reinforced or primed response, right? So if my daughter playing her Harry Potter Hogwarts mystery game, if I had gone in there and I had given her the right response on that question the first time, the next time she went in there, she would see that she would have a faint memory of this response and she would choose it. And that now would be the correct response. Does that make sense? So we've primed or we programmed this to be the correct response. So this is one of the goals of errorless learning. So some techniques that we can use. First is this idea of priming. Priming is where we're going to show or we're going to demonstrate, we're going to say, teach, or we're going to have the client perform the correct response immediately before they're asked to do it in context. And so the 90% rule here is you never ask for a response unless you're 90% sure the person's capable or able to give you the correct response. So, for example, if my daughter were playing that Harry Potter game and it was response A, B, and C, and I were instructing her about, okay, so the question says, my friend wants to do A, B, or C. And I'd go through those A, B, or C, and we talk about the rationale, how those might fit to the question, but I think the correct answer is A, right? So now before we answer, we want to remember it's not B, it's not C, the correct answer is A. So the question is, my friend wants to do, the correct answer is A, so you're going to pick, and she's like, I'm going to put A, and then she picks A, right? So we only ask for a response when we know with 90% certainty that we're going to get the correct response. We use cueing as much as we can, often referring back to the answer or having visual cues that respond to the answer. There's a video I'll show you here in a second. I hope it works through this format, which is really good at demonstrating this. And then when we can, we begin to fade those cues out. But we don't fade the cues or the prompts out until we are certain that the individual is consistently going to give us the right response. The concept of repetition is pretty simple, right? You're just going to repeat, repeat, repeat. Rinse, wash, repeat. But try to find creative ways, if you can, to get the client to engage in using the same strategy to give you that correct answer in different ways, both within the sessions. This might be having them do the same thing over and over again in this session. If you're teaching them, say, I don't want to use that example because I'm going to use that later on. Let's say you're trying to do relaxation strategies with your client in learning how to the steps of like progressive muscle relaxation. It would be repeating that over and over and over in session. And then also a cross session. So the next time we met, I would probably begin reviewing those relaxation techniques or the progressive muscle relaxation techniques with them. Again, cueing them, prompting them, and having them respond, showing me that they understand or they know what's expected of them. So I'm going to see if this video will play. Maybe Rachel, if you can let me know if you can see it and if you can hear it. I think this does a good example of showing this. Is that, you guys see that? Do you hear it?
I don't hear anything yet. When you went to share your screen, did you select options and share sound as well?
Oh, I did not. How do I do this? Let me try this again.
Hi, Susan. How are you?
Hi, I'm okay.
All right. All right. Well, today we're going to do something new in therapy. I want to help you learn and remember that every day, now that you're home, you need to leave with your mom and get on a bus at 8 o'clock every morning, okay? We want you to remember that so that you can help her get you ready in time so that the two of you get out of the house so you can make the bus, okay? So you need to be ready to leave the house at 8 o'clock. So here's a picture of the clock. And this says 8 o'clock, right? Mm-hmm. So what time do you need to be ready to leave the house?
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock is correct.
Yeah.
8 o'clock, you have to be ready to leave the house. 8 o'clock. What time?
At 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock is right. What time do you need to be ready to leave the house?
8 o'clock.
Excellent. 8 o'clock. What does that say?
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock. 8 o'clock is the time you have to be ready to leave the
bus.
You have to be ready to leave the house.
Leave the house at 8 o'clock.
At 8 o'clock. That's right. You got to leave the house at 8 o'clock. Excellent. What time?
At 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock. You leave the house at
8 o'clock.
Excellent. So that quickly shows errorless learning where the...
So how did you see both the principle of priming and repetition used in that presentation?
He definitely allowed time for the individual to respond multiple times. So both that priming and that repetition.
Right. So she slowed down the session, to slow down the expectation, the demand, right? And then repeatedly asked the question, and then primed her by saying 8 o'clock repeatedly, given the context that you leave at 8 o'clock. How did she visually prompt her, cue her?
She used the piece of paper showing the time.
Yeah, so she had a clock that showed, we didn't get to see the clock, unfortunately, but I imagine it had either I don't know if it was digital or an analog clock, but the display said 8 o'clock, right? And then when she asked her, again, cueing her, you need to leave the house at, she even pointed with her fingers, right? She referenced the answer to her to make sure she knew this is what the expected answer to give was, is 8 o'clock, okay? When she asked her what she needed to leave what, and she was expecting the house, she said bus. So there was an error there. How did the clinician respond to that error?
She repeated the sentence saying you got to leave the house at 8 o'clock.
Yeah. And she didn't say wrong or you did that bad, right? I forgot to mention this, but part of error-full learning is when we're being taught something and we do something wrong, we usually get negative feedback. We're like, wrong, right? And that's usually emotionally jolting, right? And that may be also in part why that the wrong response gets primed for the individual. There's kind of an emotional tie to that. So in errorless learning, if a person makes a mistake, you don't draw attention to the error. You correct it as neutrally as you can. So again, trying to reinforce the correct response, minimizing the reinforcing of the wrong response. And over time, again, depending on how severely impaired individual people see, this can be very helpful to teach those skills. Those become the response sets, the schemas, if you will, that they will respond in the future when they're faced with those challenges. Can you guys still see the slides? Okay, I'm sure. All right. So another technique is just strategizing. And so with strategies, with errorless learning, you want to, one, make sure that the information you're presenting is clear. There's clarity of understanding, that they understand very clearly what's expected of them. We need to simplify this as much as possible. Use simple, level appropriate language. So again, if they're functioning at a 3rd, 4th grade level of language understanding, we want to use simple sentences and minimize how much abstract words or reasoning we require of them. Try not to use clinical jargon. So an example I have here, I see over here, is you see this bowl of sugar. So one of the things we do with clients at the hospital who are in DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, for those of you, if you're familiar with that, there's a skill called Dear Man Give Fast. And it's a skill, it's an acronym to help us remember those things that we can do to improve interpersonal relationships, how we can say yes to a request or no to a request, or make a request, how we can improve the relationship between people. The give in particular stands for being gentle, acting interested, validating, and doing this in an easy manner, interacting in an easy manner. Well, that's all well for someone who's cognitively intact, right? You say give, and they have to remember what each of the letters in the give stands for, what that represents in terms of their behavior. That's pretty complex. But one way we can simplify this is we use the expression more sugar, right? Or give sugar. What is sugar? Most people understand that sugar is a sweetener, right? When we're interacting with people, we should be more sweet, be sweeter. They kind of understand that. That's something kids typically understand. So we can simplify that language. If you're using organized or manualized treatments, you may have to look at the jargon that's in those and say, is this age appropriate for this group that I'm working with for their language level? Can I simplify this down and use different language that would make it easier for them to grasp or understand? So it's an example again, be sweet versus give. Be more sugar as opposed to give, be sweet. We need to break each task down into its smaller steps and then repeatedly drill those smaller steps until the individual is able to respond effectively. So give me an example. This may be you have an individual who you've asked to do a thought record, or maybe tracking their an emotion record, tracking their emotions, which for an average functioning individual is something you can do. Like here's an emotion sheet. I want you to record your emotions on a day-to-day basis. Well, that may be too much or overwhelming for an individual. You may need to simplify that. So what are the basic steps of that? One is just recognizing emotions. Do they recognize their emotions? That may be where you start. They recognize happy, sad, fearful, worry, anxious, disgust, right? These basic emotions. Once they can master identifying those, then you move on to the next step of like, okay, now we need to have you identify those across a day. Maybe they identify it just on one day of the week. Okay. Hope that makes sense. I'm recognizing time. I know Richard said don't rush through this, but I'm feeling rushed. So I'm going to start to speed up here a little bit. So if it goes too fast, just let me know. Your tasks need to be doable, should be well within their ability to do. If you're asking your clients to fill out, again, a thought record, but they can't write, they're probably not going to tell you that, right? But if you've learned from their assessment that they have a written expression disorder or they have physical problems that prohibit their ability to hold or utilize a pencil, then you need to look at a way to solve this, right? Maybe they are just verbally responding, or maybe they have a voice recorder they can give their responses in. You need to make sure the tasks that they're doing are doable, things within their capacity to do. We want to anticipate where problems may arise and then pre-correct them. So here's an example. I had a client who I would have her report her subjective units of distress, her SUDs, for the week. And she would always come in and everything. She talked about she's at 100. If something happened, she's at 100. And when we got talking about it, I realized she's not really at 100. She's more like at 55, 60. It's elevated, but not like 100. So I learned that I had to, and I anticipated that when I asked her for a SUD, she was going to jump all the way up to 100. So I had to remind her, like, remember, 100 is like you're at the worst, and like the trauma is happening to you again. So when you encountered this experience this week, where was your SUDs? And she'd be like, oh, it's probably more like a 35, 40, right? So I anticipated that she needed to be prompted or primed to give a more accurate representation. So again, where we can pre-correct. And then this idea of collaborate, where you can do things with your clients. The saying I always use is this: I do it, we do it, and now you're going to do it, right? So I model the behavior. So for example, if we're doing like in positive psychology, one of the things we have them do is a daily record of positive or good things that happen. They're asked to record 3 things each day that were good that happened to them. Well, that's a lot to ask. And so, one, they have to understand, what does it mean having good happen? What does that even mean? So I might model like, hey, today is payday. That's a great thing for me. I'm loving payday, right? My friend told me I had awesome shoes, and I ate lunch without spilling anything down the front of my shirt. Those are 3 positives for me today. So I model what that looks like in a variety of things. And then I might say, let's do this together. Let's see if we can identify 3 positive things, or maybe even 1 positive thing that happened in session together today. And then once we do that, then it might be, okay, now can you think of something positive that happened to you today? So we model, I do it, we do it together. And then once I feel like they understand the task and they're going to be able to give me the correct response, then I prompt them to make a response or to give a response. And then in vivo coaching, again, this is where it to be the most effective, and it may not always be the case, but where we can, trying to find ways to do skills coaching in the moment with the client. Whether we go out into the public, so I was going to do a task at the end here, but we'll skip to it. Like if my friend Tim, right, if I wanted to do some in vivo coaching with him and his approach to this receptionist and his inappropriate use of a pickup line, what might that look like? Right. We could talk about it in session. We could practice, model a couple of things he could say, appropriate responses. The receptionist makes eye contact. What can you say that's appropriate? Right. And then go out and see how he does and give him direct feedback in this session. Like, we're not going to say, are you tired? Because you've been running on my mind all day. We're going to say, I need to check out, or I need to pay my bill for seeing Dr. Llyod, right? We're going to practice what appropriate interactions are with the receptionist, and we're going to do that enough times that that's modeled and then gets ingrained as part of the new skill set. Limitations, we've talked a little bit about this, but again, control the amount of times. For most clients, a 60-minute session, for most clients who are cognitive impaired, a 60-minute session is not appropriate. Reducing the time, reducing the demand or the expectations of them for that task, making it more simple. We've kind of talked about this. I'm just going to skip a little ahead. Modify the input. So here's where you want to consider their learning preferences. Are they a visual learner? Are they more one who learns through reading? Are they one who requires more like use of words or expressions, or is it some combination of the two? Try to incorporate their learning preferences when you're discussing and talking with them. But we need to be careful, because sometimes we might come in like we've heard, like, well, it's important to have multiple different modalities when you're teaching. Well, that can be true for someone who's cognitively capable, but it could also be overwhelming for someone who has cognitive impairments, right? Think of that cognitive load. If we're coming in and we're having them read something and we have all these visuals that we're having to track as well, and we're talking all at the same time, we're thinking, oh, we're using multimodal sensory input, this is going to be great. It could also be overwhelming. But if we know this person does better with tactile information, then maybe we find a way to present that information through tactile alone. So again, minimizing it, but personalizing it to their learning needs. Similarly, modify the output. If they're required to respond, how can we help minimize the difficulty they may have? So this might be the use of personal exchange communication system like the text cards. If a person struggles with writing, they might dictate something that you write down in response instead of having them to write it. Again, we can use props or other tangible items as a means, like if we're having them practice, paced breathing, maybe they have a box that they're tracing, the four-corner breathing we call it, where they're tracing along that, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. So it's a modified prop or something for their response. So I was going to do another activity here, but I won't do it for the sake of time, but I'll just describe it. I had this picture of, some lovely tropical area. Guided imagery is often a technique we use in working with clients who are emotionally dysregulated. Again, this may be hard for a person who's cognitively impaired. They may not have the ability to, you think of the demands of what it takes to visualize and to put yourself in that situation. So rather than having them visualize, you might actually just bring in a picture and have a specific task. Like, look at this picture. Is this a pleasant picture to you? Pleasant's a big word. What does that even mean, right? Do you enjoy this picture? Is this a place you would like to be? Now imagine, what would you do if you were standing on that beach? What would it be like? And so rather than having them to generate these images within their mind, they can utilize a picture to kind of help them do a similar task and to engage the task. Also will help probably keep their attention. So again, another example how you can modify your approach to minimize the cognitive demand, the cognitive impact. So you really get to the root of what you're asking them to do. The last principle here is just to reinforce and, just celebrate with the client. Celebrate, it doesn't need to be big. If you think back to the video I showed, You know, she was when the woman gave the right response, 8. What did the facilitator do? She said, excellent. Excellent, right? She just gave a verbal praise. So incorporating that where you can, small for the small items, and then incorporate big for big items. If they make major milestones, have a little prize or reward. Maybe what we'll do often with the clients here at the hospital is the kids will get to watch a YouTube video. Simple, right? I want to watch a Taylor Swift music video. Great. Make sure it's appropriate. We'll put it on. They get to watch that. It's a simple task that rewards them for it. Doesn't have to be anything major. Don't have to go buy them a car. Have to be a big prize. Just something that's within your value system and something you're capable of doing. But then again, acknowledges the success that they had. So here's what I was going to do is practice like with my friend Tim. How can we use these principles of errorless learning to help him approach the receptionist? I kind of gave you the example, but you know, if you want to practice this some more, I will invite you to do this on your own. All right, just a couple more slides to get through here. Additional goals. When we're communicating with our clients, and this is a good general idea as well, but particularly with clients who are cognitively compromised, we want to build hope. So much of their life is experiencing difficulties. And so instill hope where we can. It should be a primary goal. We want to use language that promotes hope. We want to challenge them. We don't want to limit our expectations, but we want to be realistic in our expectations and push them to if they're capable of reaching B, we want to go to C, right? And just really work with them. And again, facilitating this with opportunities for them to thrive and succeed and celebrating that. And when they successfully reach C and repeatedly continue to demonstrate C, then we're going to start shooting for D. This idea of focusing on addition, not subtraction. Again, we don't want to try to focus on the negative behaviors that we want to see go away. We want to focus more on what are the positive behaviors that we can introduce, that we can reinforce, and that will then replace those negative behaviors. It's not enough to punish somebody for a behavior you don't like. We want to reinforce the behaviors we do want to see, right? So if my friend at the receptionist desk, I want to reinforce using appropriate behaviors, not just punishing the bad behavior, right? So it's like, okay, when he does interact with the receptionist in an effective and appropriate way, that gets reinforced and celebrated. So in the future, when he's in those similar situations, that will be more of the intrinsic motivations. It makes him feel good. He has a successful encounter. He's not ostracized or sworn at or yelled at by the person who's on the receiving end and not happy with how he's responding. This is the idea of intrinsically motivating them to use the skills they're learning because they're benefiting them in ways that are helpful and provide meaning. And then last, where we can, make learning fun. We use so many board games. My family, we play a lot of board games, and it's amazing to me how many of these board games have built into them just different cognitive skill sets, right? Reasoning, different things that are things we're going to focus on helping them to improve. So if you can find a way to use a game, it makes it fun and interesting. Or if you can find a way to make it interesting to the person. So for example, we have a client here who struggles with their memory. We were trying to do some memory training with them, but she was really big into fashion. And so the clinician who was working with them took the time to print out made a memory game, like a match and memory game, using different fashion, like clothing and pictures of whatever I guess is in vogue right now. And that really engaged this client, right? Because a typical memory game wouldn't be something that she would want to do because it's difficult. But now that we made this game using fashion icons and fashion symbols that she loves, shoes and clothing, purses, all these different accessories, she really, really got into that and was able to do that for longer in the session. So again, if you can make the activity something that's enjoyable and or meaningful to them, you'll get more buy-in and more likely to have them to reduce some of that emotional impact from cognitive. Now it's fun, it's engaging, even though it might be challenging, it is at least engaging, keeping their interest. Groups versus individual sessions. So if you're considering skills training in a group format versus an individual format, there's some things to be thinking about. One, the groups can be very effective time management wise. You can get more clients, more bang for your buck. but you want to consider like the level of functioning of the clients involved. If you got some clients that are up here in their cognitive demand, others that are way down here, it may not be successful. The exception to that, because you're gonna have either these people getting bored, disengaged, or these people feeling like they're falling behind, they can't keep up. The exception to that would be what we've done here is we'll have like those who are higher functioning maybe go through the group first time and then come back a second time and then take on a peer mentoring role where they kind of help teach the skills or mentor one of their peers in the group. And that can be effective, and you have to consider the interaction of those clients. It's appropriate, the intensity of the emotional demand on the mentor, if that may be too much for them. These are all things that we want to consider. If you're going to do a group, I would recommend having a co-facilitator or co-leader, because you have one person who can be leading the instruction or the discussion and the activities, and one person who's helping to manage maybe other things that are going on, the client level stuff. Like if there's clients becoming frustrated, or clients disengaged, or clients leaving the group, you have someone who can kind of help manage that behavior and bring them back or remove them as the case may be. And then I've got a couple of resources here if you want them. These are resources we use at State Hospital. There's the Emotion Regulation Skills System for Cognitively Challenged Clients. It's a book that goes through a lot of what we just talked about, and then some, and specifically talking about DBT skills and modifying those for individuals who have cognitive limitations. And then there's also the Cognitive Remediation for Schizophrenia by Dr. Twomley. This is looking at more of like targeting things like memory and adaptive functioning if you're in that, if that's kind of your focus of what you're doing. So I feel like I just ran through that, but we're done. So I'll leave the time for some questions, or if you want to jump into your other presentation with no questions, I'm good.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Llyod. Let's give it a minute or two for questions before we jump into a quick case scenario. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Llyod currently?
Sweet.
All right. If you do think of anything, feel free to drop it in the chat, and we'll make sure we get to it before the end of today's session. I have just a short case and I'm mixing up all my words now as I'm trying to switch screens and talk at the same time. I have a brief case scenario discussion. If you've attended one of these sessions before, you've probably heard a little bit of my spiel. Before I ended up here at the IDRPP, I was managing residential habilitation services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I spent a lot of time in homes as well as in doctors' offices and therapist offices with clients. I have worked shifts as a direct support professional. So this is something I'm very passionate about. I think that knowledge is power, especially for the people who support individuals with disabilities. So while I don't believe any of us other than Dr. Llyod here are mental health providers, we can use this information to advocate for the people that we provide services for. So with that being said, this is a case scenario based loosely on an experience of mine. The background on this particular case, we have John, who is a 35-year-old autistic male with mild intellectual disability. He works at a local sporting goods store and enjoys playing board games at a local game shop. He lives in his own apartment and receives 10 hours of supportive living services per week. Generally, he has established an effective routine to complete his activities of daily living, get to work on time, and keep his apartment in order. One day at work, John started feeling sweaty and short of breath. His heart was racing and he felt dizzy. He called his primary care provider the next day, who said that he was probably just anxious and recommended that he practice some breathing exercises. Over the last few weeks, he's been feeling this way almost daily for up to an hour at a time. When he feels this way, he can't focus and feels like he can't move. He was half an hour late to his shift earlier this week because of it. So you've received a call from the disability service provider letting you know that John was late to work, and this is something that is starting to affect his ability to do what he needs to do. Our goals in this situation are to determine what your role is, and identify 2 actions you can take to support John in identifying and managing what he may be experiencing so he can maintain employment and keep his apartment. And also direct John to the appropriate resources for continued support. So the first question is, generally, as a support coordinator, how would you describe your role in a situation like this?
So I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking that the first thing that I'd want to do is just be supportive, emotionally, for my person, and then what resources he already has, and how I can help him connect with those, and then is there other resources that he may need that we could obtain if he doesn't already have them. So if he's struggling with employment, maybe we could consider some employment services. That might be creating the anxiety. Maybe refer him to some sources to figure out exactly what's creating that, so we can maybe target that a little bit better. That's how I'd see my role, and just let him know that we'll be there to try to help him through this.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Thinking back to what Dr. Llyod has talked about today, what are 2 specific actions we can take to support John in identifying and managing what he's experiencing?
I think asking him what he was feeling before the anxiety attack and identifying when it happened, which is a lot of looking back into.
Yeah, that could be helpful to make sure that we're connecting him with the right resources. And I think generally in our interactions with John is remembering the role of cognitive load and making sure that when we're talking about something that could potentially be emotionally distressing for John, as this has been a big challenge for him, is keeping that in mind. Dr. Llyod, do you have any suggestions as far as what a support coordinator could do in this situation to help connect John with the right resources?
Just building upon kind of what you just said, if you're trying to identify what may have been a precipitating factor for his anxiety, again, that requires a lot of self-awareness, that may be overwhelming. But just going back to and I don't remember if you said these details. If I get them wrong, I apologize. But let's say this happened on a Wednesday. John, can you walk us through what happened on Wednesday? What did you do when you first woke up? And just see if you can put together simply a map of what would happen. And then you might learn through that. So when you might, oh, this may have been a precipitating cause, or maybe this. Then you can go into a little bit more detail in helping to see if you can identify. But I'm wondering, it seems like you had, get making this up. It seems like you had a lunch with your mom, but your mom was late, and that made you worry that you were going to be late to work, or cause you to get upset, right? And then can maybe help walk him through. I wonder if that maybe increased your anxiety of being at work. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Has anybody experienced a similar situation of trying to navigate a potential mental health concern with the client and trying to provide support at the same time?
I have. It was pretty much like the same approach that happened. Was like, can you walk me through like what was going on during that day? Do you remember like what you were feeling? do you need any time to kind of remember what was happening at that time, and if you need a break from the discussion? That was kind of my approach to it, and just kind of going from that.
Nice. Thanks, Melissa.
In some of these situations I've had where you can also use people that know them well, maybe at the employment site, or that work with them at home, that might know more than maybe they're able to express, and kind of pick up on some things, and you could follow up with them too. That's been really helpful in a couple of situations that are similar to that.
Yeah, maybe working with some of their natural supports to see what other information we can find would be helpful.
I'm trying to remember. Did you say he was working with a therapist as well?
He had not been working with a therapist.
I had not been working with a therapist. Okay. So I'm thinking, like, in terms of, I think this falls both within the concept of therapy as well as just kind of coordinating care. Maybe reviewing some skills or techniques that can be useful for managing anxiety and modeling those, practicing them with them, right? Talking about how breathing can really help center us, really can bring down when we're feeling nervous. So we have some of these tightness in our chest. I would use those simple words to describe what it might be like for them, which he may have a hard time describing. Sometimes when we get nervous, I feel like I have a hard time breathing. And it feels like my chest is constricted. And so I find that working some deeper breaths into my day can help me feel more relaxed, and then model that and have him do that with me. Where I was like, okay, you see me, here's how I'm doing. I'm gonna breathe in for 3 seconds, or I'd say 5 seconds. I'm gonna exhale now for 7. And do that several times, and have him do it with you. So you get into that synchronous behavior or pattern. And then, okay, now, John, I want you to try this on your own. Let's pretend you're at work and you're starting to feel that tightness in your chest. How would you do your breathing?
Yep. So sounds like we can, though I'm not a licensed mental health professional, we can help encourage using skills to manage some of those more difficult moments. And hopefully that's while we're working to connect them with a therapist, potentially, to see if we need some more intense support.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with everybody kind of being a life coach in the moment.
We need that community element. Big fan of increasing everybody's mental health literacy so we can help support each other. Absolutely.
And that's why I asked if you knew he was working with a therapist, then it would be like coordinating with that therapist what they're doing in session and how you could facilitate what they're doing in session as part of your conversations outside of therapy. Again, and not taking on the therapist role, but more like just reinforcing, modeling, helping to coach those in vivo moments.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Not serving as the therapist, because that's really not our role, but being able to support that and making sure that the therapy is successful and that we're being a reinforcer. Absolutely. Well, has anybody else thought of any questions for Dr. Llyod or for me? If not, we can start wrapping up. Be sure to fill out the survey. That link is in the chat if you'd like a CEU or a certificate of attendance. I'll drop my email here as well, again, just in case you have any questions for me. Dr. Llyod, would you be willing to send me a PDF version of these so I can share it with everyone?
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to end our recording, and I will keep this up for just another minute for those of you who might still need the survey link or my email. Otherwise, we'll close this out shortly.